the cognitive processes involved in making choices, to the control panel that we use to direct that machinery. The basic idea is that our cognitive machinery needs to be directed towards some end. There must be a motivation that drives the decision-making, some goals that determine how the machinery is to be used. So, just like some machines can be used for many different purposes by adjusting the settings, we can think of the same basic sets of cognitive procedures being bent towards any number of different ends, depending on the needs, goals, and desires of the decision maker. But when I talk about motivation as a control panel, I want to be clear about what kind of control panel you should picture. If you've ever seen the controls on a cutting-edge piece of manufacturing equipment, like a top-of-the-line milling machine or a CNC router, with a beautiful, intuitive, clearly labeled interface, with tolerances down to fractions of a millimeter, yeah, if that's what you're picturing, don't picture that. That's not the kind of control panel I want you to imagine. When I was an undergrad, I had the coolest job on campus. I was hired to run our school's proton accelerator. I know, right? I would fire, for my job, protons at samples. And based on the characteristic X-rays that were emitted, we could tell the elemental composition of the sample. But I know what you're probably thinking of when I say I worked with a proton accelerator. You're probably thinking of one of those superconducting supercolliders, miles across, buried underground. No. Ours was a Van de Graaff accelerator, which tend to run much smaller. They're shaped like a giant Tylenol gel cap. The one that I worked with was about 12 feet long. And it had been donated to the university after it had served out its useful life somewhere in industry. So this thing wasn't exactly top of the line. In fact, it was ancient. If memory serves, it was built sometime in the 1940s. And it was gloriously analog. Everything on it, all the gauges and the dials and the knobs, it looked like something that a lackey would be playing on in the background of some Cold War era sci-fi movie. You know, the main characters are talking with the scientist about what could be done to stop the giant radioactive spider attacking the town, and then one of the scientist's assistants would be behind them in the background, seated at the control panels of this proton accelerator. That's what you should have in mind when we talk about the control panel that guides our cognitive machinery. Think about a 1940s era giant metal cabinet full of decades-old analog gauges and dials and indicators. It's been repaired dozens of times over the decades. Some of the knobs are no longer even attached to anything behind the console. Much of it's not labeled, and you're not sure how many of the labels that are there you can actually trust. That's the kind of control panel we're dealing with. We don't have perfect control over our cognitive machinery, but we can usually point it in the right general direction. Many of the knobs and levers on our control panel will fall under the broad category of goals, which is the topic of today's lecture. Goals direct our cognitive machinery in specific directions. So now may be a good time to ask, what are goals anyway? And how should we define them? Well, goals are psychological representations of desired end states. Most psychologists who study goals define end states rather broadly. Essentially, something, big or small, that would be different from how the world exists now. The psychologists James Austin and Jeffrey Vancouver, who, confusingly, live in Ohio and New York, argued that these end states can be outcomes, events, or processes. They can range from biological set points like body temperature to complex cognitive depictions of desired outcomes like career success. These goals are motivational in the most basic sense. They are the reason that we engage in actions. Unless our behavior is automatic or habitual, it must be motivated by something. When we think of goals, we tend to think of something aspirational, to be worked on over weeks or months or years. Lose 20 pounds before the reunion. Get a master's degree. Read the complete works of Shakespeare. And those certainly are goals. But to a psychologist, grabbing the blanket off the back of the couch because your feet are cold is also a goal-driven behavior. The desired end state is warmer toes. And that goal drove the decision to cover up and the subsequent action of snuggling under the blanket. So, that is the first thing to remember when thinking about goals and how they drive human decision-making. We're not just talking about New Year's resolutions. In fact, that kind of broad, sweeping, higher-order goal reflects just a tiny portion of the motivated behavior that we all engage in. Goal theorists have long argued that the gap between reality, the world as it currently is, and our desired end state creates a kind of psychological tension within us. And it is this tension that motivates decision-making, and ultimately, actions. This idea was first championed by a German psychologist named Kurt Lewin back in the 1930s. According to this tension systems view, a need is created by a gap between the goal and reality, and needs generate tension. This tension is unpleasant, and so people move to resolve it by reducing the need and thus fulfilling the goal. To put this in control panel terms, we might think of our adjusting of knobs and dials as being a response to the tension created by the gap between our desired and current states. And that leads us to activate our decision-making machinery toward the end of easing the tension, ideally by making decisions that move our current state closer to our desired state. Goals can be distinguished from other psychological constructs in part because once they've been activated, once that tension has been created, goals tend to be enduring, at least relative to many other psychological forces. Goals don't fade like mindsets. In fact, there is evidence that under some circumstances, an unfulfilled goal will actually get stronger over time until it's fulfilled. In lab studies, that is one of the ways that psychologists establish that some behavior is goal-driven. If you can force a delay before people act, the effects get stronger, then there is a good chance that you've activated a goal. One way to think about goals is in terms of goal hierarchies. That is, ordering goals by their importance. We'll talk about a few different goal hierarchies in this part of the course. I guess we should get the big one out of the way first. In 1943, Abraham Maslow proposed a goal hierarchy in his paper called A Theory of Human Motivation. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is generally depicted as a triangle, with the most basic or foundational needs at the bottom, and then progressively higher order needs layered on top. Starting at the bottom and moving up, the goal stages are physiological, safety, belongingness, esteem, and self-actualization. According to Maslow, lower order needs must be met before a person is willing or able to focus on higher order goals. Maslow's hierarchy is quite well known. Unfortunately, as a scientific theory, it's largely fallen flat. Researchers who have investigated the hierarchy have found little evidence to support the notion that people rank goals in the way Maslow proposed. So psychologists in general, and psychologists who study goals in particular, tend to not be great fans of Maslow. But I'm going to suggest that the structured list of goals that Maslow created shouldn't be completely discarded. I teach in a business school, and so in addition to exposing my students to scientific theories, I also teach my students about frameworks. If you've had any business training, I'm sure you've heard of these. Porter's 5 Forces, marketing's 4 Ps. Frameworks are different from theories. They don't generate falsifiable predictions or hypotheses that can be tested. Instead, they're useful because they organize information in a way that makes it easier to understand and gain insights from. They're not true or valid in any scientific sense, but they can be useful. And that's the category I'd put Maslow into. The hierarchy doesn't work as a hierarchy. It makes predictions about goal-driven behavior that simply cannot be supported. But as a framework, perhaps it can be useful. It organizes goals into different groups or categories that can then help expand our view of the types of needs that can motivate decision-making. By considering the framework as a whole, it might better help us remember and recognize the full breadth of motivations that drive us. But let's leave further discussion of goal hierarchies for another time. We'll discuss some other, more scientific hierarchies in subsequent lectures. For the remainder of this lecture, I want to give you an overview of the types of questions researchers have investigated when looking at how motivation influences choice. The first area I want to touch on is the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motives are those that are responding to internal rewards or punishments. We engage in some behavior because we like it, or because it seems like the right thing to do, or because we would feel guilty if we didn't. We contrast that, of course, with extrinsic motivations, those that respond to some external reward or punishment. So we may do something because someone is paying us to, or because we anticipate the praise we will receive from doing it, or because we'll have to pay a fine if we don't. In many cases, people seem to use extrinsic rewards or punishments in the hopes of inducing an intrinsic motivation. So we might offer to pay our kids for good grades when they're young, in the hopes that this will lead to their being motivated to get good grades on their own when they're older. Companies design loyalty programs to reward customers for behaviors the company likes, like repeated purchases, in the hopes that the customers will come to really love the product and start buying it even without the incentive. And I'm not going to say that that never works, but the research so far suggests that intrinsic and extrinsic motivations might be more of an either-or situation, rather than a both-and. In fact, research indicates that providing an extrinsic motivation often kills the intrinsic motivation, or at least reduces its strength. One fascinating field study was conducted at daycare centers in Israel. The daycare centers had a strict pickup time policy. It was understood that parents were to pick up their children by a certain time so that the workers would be able to close up shop and go home to their own families. And compliance was generally pretty good. Not perfect, but pretty good. At each of these daycare centers, on average, there were about 10 late pickups per week. Two behavioral economists worked with the owners of these facilities to introduce a fine to see if that would change the compliance rate. A fine of about $3 per child was levied against parents who were more than 10 minutes late. Normatively, we would expect the fine to increase compliance. Parents who are late are strictly worse off after the policy change than they were before. They go from being charged nothing to being charged something. But things didn't get better. They got worse. Within about a month of introducing the new policy, late pickups had doubled to about 20 per week. Why? What happened? Well, the researchers argued that the extrinsic motivator of a small fine reduced the strength of the intrinsic motivator, guilt, that had kept parents compliant before. Before the fine, picking up one's child on time was just seen as the right thing to do. It was a moral obligation. Being late would make the parent feel guilty and irresponsible. And those intrinsic motivations can be powerful. But once a fine was imposed, well, now that's an entirely different story. Now we have an extrinsic motivator. And now people are able to evaluate whether it is worthwhile to pay the fine given what else they might do with that time. Do I end this meeting early? Or do I just pay the $3 and finish up? Do I skip that last errand that might make me run a bit late? Or do I just pony up $6 for not being able to pick up Liz and Johnny on time? When the motivation became extrinsic, people made different decisions, trying to decide whether the effort required to be on time was worth the pain of paying a small fine. And often, it wasn't. After a few months, the researchers canceled the new policy and removed the fine. But the damage at that point was already done. The intrinsic motivation had been reduced, and it did not immediately return after the fine elapsed. The late pickup rate continued to hover at around 20 per week after the fine was removed. You may be about to argue that the fines would have worked if only they had been bigger. And you are right. If they had charged $50 or $100 per child each time a parent was late, you'd better believe the parents would not be late very often. But it is remarkable that offering no punishment at all can be more effective than offering a punishment, at least up to a certain point. And it turns out that the same is true for rewards. James Heyman and Dan Ariely asked a group of people how likely they would be to help a friend move some furniture. When the question was just phrased as, "How likely would you be to help a friend move a couch?" then people responded that they would be very willing. But when a different group was offered a small amount of money in order to do the same task, the willingness to help dropped off significantly. If your friend needs you, you probably feel obligated. This is what friends do for each other, and the intrinsic sense of duty is powerful. But when that friend offers you a couple of bucks to do the same, well, now you start to think about how much your time is worth. Is it worth going out of your way, all the way over to your friend's house, to engage in physical labor for just a few bucks? No. When the researchers increased the payment amount, they were able to get people back up to the same willingness to help that they had been at when they were offered nothing. So it's not like people don't respond to incentives. But, as with the daycare study, there is a payment level at which people are more motivated by getting nothing. This basic finding that offering an extrinsic motivator, a cash payment in one case, a monetary fine in another, appears to actually dampen the intrinsic motivation that had previously existed. And these findings are not isolated one-off effects. There's actually quite a large literature documenting what has been called the overjustification effect. People paid to do puzzles or solve word games spent less time playing them than people who were not paid. Paying children to play with a favorite toy leads to their playing with that toy less. Paying people to donate blood actually leads to a decrease in donation rates. The other type of goal research I want to tell you about, aside from intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, is the research on goal pursuit. There's been a lot of interest in what causes people to work harder accomplishing a goal versus slacking off or even giving up. One of the key determinants of goal pursuit is the perception of progress. It turns out that whether we think we are making progress towards a goal is a big driver of how hard we continue working on it. But exactly how perceptions of progress affect us is kind of complicated. Let's start with what's called the goal gradient hypothesis. This goal pursuit prediction is based on an observation made in the 1930s by an animal psychologist named Clark Hull. Hull did research by observing rats. Run them through mazes, teach them to press levers to get food pellets, that kind of thing. Hull noticed something interesting. He found that rats ran progressively faster the nearer they got to a reward. And he gave this observation about rat behavior just about the least intuitive label he could think of. He called it the goal gradient hypothesis. Goal gradient, the observation that rats tend to exert more effort toward achieving a goal the closer they are to the reward, has been very influential in animal behavior theory. But it recently received renewed interest as a possible phenomenon in humans. In 2006, Ron Kevitz, Oleg Erminsky, and Huang Zhang from Columbia University published a series of studies looking at consumer behavior at a coffee shop based on a punch card loyalty program. You know the type I'm talking about. You have about 40 of them in your wallet right now. Each time you purchase a coffee or a sandwich or an oil change, they stamp your card. And after some specified number of purchases, you get a reward, like a free cup of coffee. So, Kevitz and his colleagues worked with the coffee shop to track each punch on the card and when the free coffee was redeemed. And sure enough, just like rats scampering down a runway towards a piece of cheese, the closer people got to getting that reward, the more frequently they stopped by that coffee shop to make another purchase. Goal gradient. Which raises the question, did people just come to love the coffee more the more they drank it? In other words, did they continue to stop by the coffee shop just as frequently after getting the free cup? No, they didn't. In a separate study, after people redeemed their free coffee reward, they were given another punch card to start the process over. This way, the researchers had multiple rounds of purchases and rewards that they could track. And sure enough, after the loyalty card had been redeemed, people reset back to their old purchase frequency. When plotted on the same graph, the purchase frequency of people redeeming their first card looks nearly identical to the people redeeming their second card. In both cases, when people got their card, it was about 3 days between visits. As more holes were punched, the time between purchases steadily reduced down to about 1.5 days. In another clever test of the goal gradient hypothesis, Kevitz and his colleagues had the coffee shop give out 2 versions of the loyalty card. Randomly, some customers got a card that required 10 punches to redeem the reward. The rest of the customers received a card that required 12 punches for the same reward. But these customers, when the barista handed them their card, they immediately punched it twice, just to be nice. So, both groups needed 10 purchases in order to get their free coffee. The group with no initial punches took 15.6 days to make those 10 purchases and redeem their reward. But the group that had 2 free punches to start off only took 12.7 days to make the same 10 purchases. At about the same time, a separate group of researchers at the University of Southern California ran a very similar study. They worked with a car wash and offered 300 patrons one of 2 loyalty cards. One simply required 8 car washes to receive a free wash. The other required 10 washes, but once again, the employees stamped the card twice when giving it to the customers, meaning that they too needed only 8 washes to redeem their reward. And consistent with the findings of the group from Columbia, that group that was endowed with phantom progress towards their goal returned to the car wash more frequently and were more likely to follow through and complete all of the purchases required for the reward. So, perceived goal progress leads people to work harder towards a goal, right? Well, sometimes. Let me tell you about another study. This one was conducted by researchers from the University of Chicago and Yale University. In this study, participants were asked to indicate how far away they were from their ideal weight. Participants were asked to color in on a number line how much weight they needed to lose in order to achieve their weight loss goals. So, if you were 3 pounds from your ideal weight, you would color in the number line until you reached the 3-pound mark. If you were 5 pounds from your goal, you would color in up to the 5-pound mark. Everyone was asked the same question, but the size of the number line differed across conditions. For some participants, the number line only went up to 5. This meant that pretty much no matter how far you were from your ideal weight, you started coloring in that line, and then you just kept coloring and coloring across that whole darn page. You just kept going. The effect was to make people feel very far from their goal. Just look at how much coloring you had to do to represent how far you were from your ideal weight. You have a lot of work ahead of you, my friend. In contrast, the rest of the participants saw a number line that went all the way up to 25. For this group, most weight loss goals required only a little bit of coloring. Just a few scribbles with a pen, and you were exactly where you needed to be. This condition imbued people with a sense of progress. People felt like they were very close to their goals. Here's where this research departs from the goal gradient studies I just told you about. After completing the number line coloring test, participants were given a gift, a choice between a chocolate bar and an apple. Now, goal gradient would predict that when people feel close to their goal, that is, when they feel they're making a lot of progress, they should accelerate towards that goal. If you feel like you were close to your ideal weight, you should work even harder to shed those last few pounds, right? So you are totally going to go for the apple. Wrong. In the condition where people had to keep coloring and coloring, where they felt that they were far from their ideal weight, less than 60% of the participants chose the chocolate bar over the apple. But in the condition where people were made to feel that they were closer to attaining their goal, that jumped up to 80% who chose the chocolate. What happened here? Well, it turns out that sometimes perceived goal progress can motivate us and cause us to work harder. But sometimes perceived progress can license us to slack off. Basically, when people felt like they were closer to their ideal weight, they felt less pressure to have to restrain themselves. It weakened the goal, and so they picked the indulgent option. What is the difference between these two cases? When does perceived progress towards a goal motivate us, and when does it license us to shirk? Well, there are probably a number of things, but let me suggest one. Recall the conditions under which Ho initially identified the goal gradient phenomenon. The rats were pursuing some concrete objective, food, and they accelerated as they got closer to that reward. The cases where subsequent researchers have identified goal gradient phenomena in people are similar. Concrete objective, free coffee, free car wash, and people accelerated their purchases as they got closer to that reward. But many of the goals we pursue in life are not of that type. Often we're not pursuing some very narrowly defined, clearly understood, concrete objective. Often we want something more nebulous: happiness, success, security. And even the intermediate goals we set to get there, like reaching some ideal weight, are not definitively rewarding in the same way that a food pellet at the end of a maze would be. Unless someone is going to give you a car when you reach your ideal weight, there's no real prize there. If you achieve that goal, you maybe high-five yourself, but then you need to wake up the next morning and choose between a banana and a Pop-Tart all over again. And it is for these softer goals, with no definitive end and weakly defined rewards, that we might expect licensing. In fact, one common bit of advice for people pursuing goals is to not tell others about your goals. And the reason is licensing. It turns out that when we tell someone we're planning on starting a diet, or we've been to the gym twice now and plan on making it a daily habit, that just the act of telling someone about the goal can be registered by part of the brain as making progress towards that goal. So just telling someone about your plans to lose weight can license you to treat yourself to that chocolate eclair after dinner. After all, you're doing pretty well with that diet, right? I mean, you've been telling people about it. That's got to count for something. I know. The mind is a perverse place, isn't it? So that's our introduction to goals. The motivations that guide our cognitive machinery are diverse. In fact, several researchers have made a name for themselves largely through just organizing the many types of goals that influence our decision-making.